classical economics treats everybody like Mr. Spock, rationally going through mathematical cost-benefit equations and coming up with a rational decision. Even if you've been trained in classical economics, you probably have a pretty good suspicion that that ain't how things work. Simply offering something to people, and why don't they take it? Or just showing them the benefits of something, and why don't you just do this differently? Isn't it obvious to you? And so the best way to understand it is through the lens of cognitive biases.
Now we're going to look at the calculation dial. And again, there's a place in the template to record your thoughts. And we're going to look at the basic calculation people will make when they're thinking about buying or using something. And then we'll look at some of the biases that might stop them from adopting it.
If you have a working understanding of at least some of the major cognitive biases, you can predict some of the goofy things that people will do. And that's really useful. It turns out that when your brain gets really big and your social behavior becomes pretty complicated, you have an information problem. There's just too much information coming your way. It has to have meaning to you, or you can't do anything with it. You've got to act on it, sometimes in very timely fashion, and there's too damn much to remember. We have some very specific responses. So, too much information, filter. Gotta have meaning, make shit up. Gotta act on it, jump to conclusions. Gotta remember, prioritize. Over time, in response, you might say, to the information problem, we developed a bunch of shortcuts that collectively became known as cognitive biases. Some of the behavior they drive is really goofy, and some of it is downright maladaptive. But on the whole, it's actually really necessary that we have these shortcuts because of the information problem. If you look at the Wikipedia entry for cognitive biases, there's, I think, 270. But there's a few that really dominate how we think and act, and they're worth understanding. A good one is that we just see every single day in our tribal politics as motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning is where you have some outcome you're really invested in, some position you're really invested in, and all of your reasoning is driven by that outcome you're trying to get to.
It's basically just letting my motivations change the way I take in information about the issue. So if I'm convinced the Apollo moon landing was a hoax, I'm not going to look up moon landing information. I'm going to look up, why was the Apollo moon landing a terrible hoax by the government?
The avoidance of that pain can drive just a tortured sequence of logic that makes no sense to anybody uninvested in that conclusion. It feels good to be reinforced in your current beliefs. So it's a simple neurochemical thing. You get something that reinforces a position you've taken, something you already believe, and it feels good to you. And so we just look for things that will confirm what we already believe because it just feels so good. And it can blind you to things that that don't reinforce what you already believe, and it can lead to active rejection of things that don't confirm what you already believe. Both either to seek pleasure or avoid pain.
For example, if I'm really strongly in favor of one political candidate, I'm only ever going to see stuff in the media that backs up that candidate, and I'm going to forget all of the stuff that backs up her opposition.
We're biased by what information is available to us. And what's available to us is stuff that just happened. We're much more motivated by some signal event that just occurred to us than maybe way more relevant and important events in the past, or certainly statistics that actually would indicate to somebody that actually that thing that just happened to you wasn't as important as you think it was.
For example, which is more dangerous, sharks or horses? Turns out horses, by like a ratio of like 20-1. But every time there's a shark attack, it's all over the news because it's terrifying. And so you remember it more, which means that you think shark attacks happen more than death by horse.
We just make decisions on the basis of whatever we could pull out of the grab bag conveniently. We remember changes of big amplitude. We remember funny stuff. We remember bizarre stuff. All that makes things more available to us rather than a real understanding of the sweep of information over time. Another one that we actually already alluded to when we talked about safety as one of the drivers of emotion is loss aversion. And we will do anything to avoid a loss, even avoiding a hypothetical loss in the future. One thing that really struck me the other day, I was seeing these videos from an experiment where they offered people who just bought a lottery ticket twice the price that they paid for it. The vast majority of people wouldn't take it because they were already invested in that number and they didn't want to face the possibility that if they lost, they might regret having given up that ticket. So much, especially with people who don't have much, can be explained by and predicted by loss aversion. And so people will make these calculations that don't make much sense except in the context of this deep-seated fear, this dread of loss. What you spent in the past on something shouldn't drive future decisions. That cost is sunk. It shouldn't affect your decision-making going forward.
The big trap of the sunk cost fallacy is continuing with something that's no longer a good idea or keeping something that wasn't worth buying. So let's say I'm like halfway through a book and I find out it's terrible. I will continue reading it and hate every moment of reading it because I'm thinking to myself, well, I've already spent 5 hours reading this book. It must be good.
I knew some people who wanted to go skiing. They rent all this gear and they had to go buy some jackets and stuff. So they made a big investment. Then they had to battle traffic all the way up on a weekend to the ski resorts. They get to the resort, they've actually made a considerable investment in going skiing. And it turned out there was an ice storm and it was just miserable conditions. This family, instead of saying, God damn it, we did all this stuff to go skiing, we're going to go skiing, they kind of sat back and said the larger mission here was to have fun. That's a sunk cost. Our goal going forward is to have fun. We're going to drive to town and go to the movies. That is avoiding the sunk cost fallacy and making good decisions. I just made that up. I actually think I did hear about it vaguely, and then I made it up. Here's the thing, it's actually really hard to swim upstream against an unfavorable cost-benefit equation. In other words, if the reality is that something is going to ultimately cost people more than it benefits, that is really going to be hard to maintain over time. But what you have to realize with this is even if you have a positive cost-benefit equation, you just have to realize there's all these different lenses they're going to look at it through and maybe reject your wonderful deal simply because it goes against these deeply ingrained patterns. So you need to have a working understanding of cognitive biases if you're to really understand how real people in the real world make decisions.
Back to yin and yang and the basic calculation. Economically, the stove is free and the pellets are cheaper than what they were previously paying. That cheapness is a powerful driver. And then the biases. We can see if there are any strong ones that stop the Inyenyeri model from working. For motivated reasoning, no, it turns out that using the stove doesn't go against any tightly held beliefs. It's a stove. For confirmation bias, same, it's a stove. For the availability bias, again, no problems. People remember what the price was and is of charcoal. For loss aversion, they removed all of the risk and you don't have to give up anything to get a stove. And lastly, Inyenyeri have done the sunk cost fallacy thing really well. Because the new stoves are free, people don't feel like they've sunk cost into the previous stoves. Now, if you're like me, you compare your intervention to Inyenyeri's and you're like, they're amazing, I could never do that. But notice how they've gotten every single bias and figured out how to remove all the barriers. Now that you know what all the biases are and what your barriers are, start removing them.
This is hard. This really requires engaging it. And in fact, a working understanding of maybe 20 of the most well understood, well-established cognitive biases would be really useful to anybody serious about behavior change. When you get a certain comfort with it, again, you'll never see things the same way. This is where emotion and calculation collide. You come out with some strange hybrid offspring that is called a decision.